All right, let's get started. I'm Siobhan O'Connor. I'm the health director at Time Magazine, and I'm very honored to be here this morning introducing Dr. Louise Greenspan. She's a pediatric endocrinologist, an undeniable leader in her field, who has studied early onset puberty in girls. She works at Kaiser Permanente and is also on faculty at UCSF. And with her book, The New Puberty, she's done something that more people in the medical field could do with trying, which is she teamed up with someone from another discipline, a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, to look at the multiple factors that are influencing early puberty in girls and the consequences of that, which are quite serious. So girls, we know, are developing earlier and earlier, and the implications of this are not very well studied from a sociological point of view, psychological, and physiological. So Dr. Louise Greenspan has done that. Her book is fantastic, but before we get into some more nitty-gritty, I think we can do with defining some terms. So what is puberty? Because we think of it as the onset of the first period, but you've told me that's not quite the case.
Yeah, so when the lay public hears puberty and puberty starting early, the common thought is that this is first period, which we call menarche. And for girls, first period is actually a very late event in puberty. It's the result of a lot of different hormonal shifts in the establishment of regular hormonal ups and downs coming from the brain to the ovaries. So that's a very late event. The first true sign of puberty in girls is actually breast budding or breast development. And that may not be something that's physically apparent, something a doctor can palpate, which is our word for feeling, and we can feel, and it's glandular tissue under the breast, which may or may not be tender. That is the first physical sign of the onset of puberty. So there's also pubic hair development, and that's a major sign, but pubic hair can come from other glands, particularly the adrenal glands, so we can't use that as a singular marker. So really it's breast development that's the main marker. So when we're talking about puberty starting earlier in girls, these may not be changes that are physically apparent to other people until it progresses.
Great. Now we'll talk in a couple minutes about you've identified 3 root causes of this. But first, every great book has an inception story, has the aha moment that led you to do it in the first place, and yeah. I'd love to hear what that is for you.
That's a long story. I'll try not to, I can talk about that for a while, but so I am a pediatric endocrinologist, and I'm also a parent. And as the research was going along in this study, which was started the year that I was pregnant with my daughter, I actually took her to the training with me. I was nursing her as I was training the research associates. And as I was able to have access to this research and interpret it, and I had a friend who I met through the study, excuse me, named Julie Deardorff, who's a psychologist who has children a couple years older than mine. We kept on joking about what we were going to put in our book, and we were going to write a book because we had all this advice, and we realized that people didn't have access to this data and information because our own friends were asking us what was going on. And after the data was published and really showing that puberty was starting earlier, of course, everybody we knew came out of the woodwork and said, why is this happening? And so Julie and I had a framework for a book, and we used to joke about our book. And then I had done some media, I think, and this is the feminist part of the conversation, which is that I was on this study with about 10 to 15 other investigators. Most of them were men. And a lot of times when the media outlets would approach me and ask me to do an interview, I'd sort of say, well, have you spoken to so-and-so? And I'd want to make sure that we all were able to contribute to these interviews. And they said, no, we want to speak to you because you're the woman and you're the mom. And I think it was great that being a parent and being female actually was an asset to me, so that's an aside. So after one of these media stories, and I don't remember one, I think it was the New York Times magazine article that I was interviewed for, a book agent approached me and asked me if I would write this book. And being a working mom, I said no for about 6 months. And then finally, Julie and I said this is the right time. So this book was sort of born a long time ago. It had many different titles in my head. So writing it was not that hard. I mean, it sounds crazy, but because we already had all the ideas formulated.
Right. I think some of the best books are the result of, looking for something out there and looking for the right book, hoping to be able to read it, and it doesn't exist, and then you go ahead and write it. So you've identified 3 key factors that give rise to early onset puberty. Can you describe what they are?
Yeah, and I think maybe, should we step back and talk about the timing of it?
Absolutely.
Because, I think I want to define actually the age of these things. Mm-hmm. So when I was in training, I was taught that age 8 is the earliest that a normal, healthy girl should be starting breast budding. And that still seemed kind of early, and that was the sort of the dogma. And then in 1997, a paper came out by a woman named Marcia Herman Gibbons as the first author that discovered that puberty was really starting earlier. There were a lot of criticisms in the field, especially my field. She was not a pediatric endocrinologist. So the pediatric endocrinology academic community came out pretty strongly. I don't know if it's because they had a chip on their shoulder that it wasn't done by one of them, but they came out pretty strongly, and there were a lot of people who criticized the study. So it was in the context of that criticism that the study that I'm a part of came out. So we followed a group of 1,200 girls for, we really are still following them, but they were 6 to 8 when we recruited them, and we studied them for 11 years. But the papers that were published were after the first 5 or so years. So we had the same group of girls. They were in San Francisco Bay Area, Cincinnati, Ohio area, and Mount Sinai School of Medicine, New York area. And very ethnically diverse, which is also unusual. And what we found was that puberty was starting earlier and earlier, and we really did see the same patterns, but even a little bit earlier than the 1997 paper. So what we found was that, remember I said 8 should be the earliest that girls are going to puberty? And what we found was that for African American girls, the average age of the onset of breast budding, on average, was 8 3/4. So it wasn't that 5% had started by age 8, it was that 50% of African American girls had started by 8 3/4. So it was a lot earlier, and even at age 7, there were a significant proportion of all the girls that started puberty. For Hispanic girls, the average age of onset of breasts was 9 1/4, and for Asian and Caucasian girls, it was 9 3/4. So the whole population was developing earlier, and not necessarily reflective of pathologic or diseases.
Right.
So our investigation and other investigations have now tried to look into what is associated with that. So we think that the three causes or the 3 risks that are most highly associated, number 1 is obesity. And that's surprising to people because the questions I get are, is it the hormones in the milk? Is it the chemicals in the sunscreens? And the main cause is obesity. And we can go into each of these with more detail, but girls that are overweight are much more likely to have onset of true breast budding and breast development early. The second cause, which is surprising to some people, is toxic stress or really high conflict in the home. And toxic stress has now become a buzzword, but there's many different ways to define that, and we can talk about that. That is something that was not known in the pediatric endocrine community, but Julie Deardorff, my co-author, who's a psychologist, knew it well. And it was actually kind of striking that these 2 fields were studying the exact same problem from 2 totally different perspectives, and were not communicating. So we do know now, we can talk about that toxic stress is a major cause. The third cause, which really we're trying to tease out, but the data is not yet there and may never be able to really be clear, is the environmental triggers, as in environmental chemicals. Those are the 3 main causes.
And what are the key sort of psychological consequences of early puberty? Because I want to drill down more on those 3 in a minute, but
Yeah.
Why is it a problem that puberty is starting earlier?
Yeah, you may think, what's the big deal? So the big deal is that the earlier you are when you go through puberty, the higher you are at risk for a whole host of physical and psychological events. Most of the studies have been done utilizing age of first period as a marker, because that's a pretty easy thing for women to remember. Nobody remembers when their breast buds started, unless they're a pediatric endocrinologist child. But you remember when your first period was. So the girls who have earlier onset of first periods are definitely at higher risk of breast cancer. And actually the investigation that Julie and I were a part of was a breast cancer prevention study looking at environmental triggers of breast cancer. If you have your period before age 11, you're at a much higher risk of breast cancer than if you have your period after age 13. But you're also at risk for other estrogen or endocrine-related cancers. You're at a higher risk for heart disease and actually all-cause mortality. So the cardiovascular community is now realizing that age of onset of puberty may be a factor in their diseases. For the psychological aspects, as a teenager, if you get puberty early, historically you've been at a much higher risk of depression, eating disorders, early sexual activity, early teenage pregnancy, and substance and alcohol use. So your basic parents' teenage nightmare. And then as an adult, you're still at a higher risk of depression and psychological concerns. So it's going to be interesting to see as the population has shifted if this is going to continue. And the question is it being different from your peers that really determines the psychological risks?
I was going to ask that. So what do you think, or what do we know so far about what is driving the depression, early sexual activity? One could imagine that if a girl is developing quicker than her peers, she's sexualized earlier than her peers, and that alone could have consequences.
We do know that psychologically being a late bloomer or an early bloomer and standing out from your peers can be a psychological stress for some kids. And we're going to talk about that isn't necessarily de facto. You can support the children so they don't feel different. But being an early bloomer, depending on the context, and I think social and family context is everything, but being an early bloomer, if you look older and you're not in an environment where you're protected, then you can be at risk for then socializing with older kids, but you don't have the prefrontal cortex development. For any of you who went to that wonderful child development session yesterday, and he mentioned that prefrontal cortex development is not fully completed till your mid-20s. So if you are 10 and you have the brain of a 10-year-old and you still do have the prefrontal cortex of a 10-year-old, but you've had your period and you look like a 14 or 15-year-old, you could then be asked to socialize, or you may be naturally drawn to socialize with the 14 or 15-year-olds and do the risk-taking behavior, which is more normal at 15, but less normal at 10, and you have even less prefrontal cortex and executive functioning. So you really do have the brain of a young child on the body of an older child. And that's one of the reasons we wrote the book, because we really wanted to empower parents to be able to intervene so they can keep their 10-year-old a 10-year-old rather than being a 15-year-old. So when you're 10 and you look older, maybe your older brother has friends who then ask you out, and you want to hang out with the older kids and you don't have the wherewithal to say no, or they offer you a drink or a joint and you're 10.
Right. You mentioned toxic stress, which is something that you mentioned, it's sort of a buzzword right now, but in the context of early puberty, it was very surprising to me. And one of the things that I learned a lot from your work is just the physiological cascade that can come from a psychological trigger. Yeah. So one of the things that share the stat about dad's absence in early puberty.
Yeah,
just talk a little bit about that.
This was an interesting one, again, that's really well known in the psychological literature that I was not aware of till I got into this field. Father absence, so not having your biological father in your home, is correlated with earlier onset of puberty. So if you grew up in a house without your biological father, you're twice as likely to get your period before age 12 than if you grew up with your biological father, whether or not you have a stepfather in the house. And that's kind of shocking if you think about it. The problem is this is where we start getting an intersection of social and biologic, right? Because I told you that there are ethnic differences in the onset of the puberty, which we don't think are genetic. We have plenty of data to show it's not genetic. So that's probably related to an intersection between, we don't know if it's pheromones, like how does the brain detect that this man is not your biological father? So the theory is that it's pheromonal, but we don't actually know.
Wow. But
it could be, there's something very primitive, and it's, part of the issue is probably related to an evolutionary mechanism, and this again is hypothesized, but the evolutionary hypothesis is that when girls are under a little bit of stress, not so much stress like famine where their bodies shut down and they don't have enough nutrient, but when you're under enough stress, the brain perceives that as we better hurry up because we may die, we need to reproduce, so let's get through all of our reproductive life fast so we can reproduce. So it's sort of the selfish gene hypothesis passed on this way. So
fascinating. So as you've made clear, obesity and overweight are definitely the number one driver here. And I think one thing that you mentioned to me the other day when we were chatting that we don't always think about is that fat sort of functions like an organ.
Right.
It has effects on the body other than just padding us here and there. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so fat is a very potent endocrine organ, endocrine system in itself, and it secretes all sorts of different hormones. Some of the hormones that it secretes, or the enzymes that it secretes, raise the levels of estrogen in the body. So for girls, if you raise estrogen levels, clearly that can have effects, including inducing breast development and then maybe triggering puberty or the other way around. So the fat tissue itself is an endocrine organ that's making estrogen.
So what obesity rates in this country keep going up. I think there's a small age group among children where it's theoretically plateaued, although I don't always buy it when I see those numbers.
Yeah, that's the younger kids supposedly.
Exactly,
I agree with
but
you.
clearly the numbers are going up and up and up. So what do we do? What are the interventions that you recommend?
We could have a whole Spotlight Health and Childhood Obesity. For 3 days we could talk about it. Boy, I mean, there's the personal, there's the policy, there's the social. So there's so many other speakers that have spoken so much about obesity, but I think part of it is education. So I'm a clinician, and I see patients every day. I run an obesity clinic, and in my urban population in San Francisco, which is very diverse, I joke that it's kind of the United Nations some days, and I love it. There's a lack of education. I think people have said this. We've lost this generation of parents. My generation of parents has lost some of the traditional cooking and traditional cooking basically, and we're so busy, and I see families that work 3 or 4 jobs, right. Or I see affluent families coming in, but they're working 12 hours, and so we're using a lot of convenience foods, and people don't know. So for example, I had one 6-year-old boy who was very overweight, and the dietitian came out and said the 24-hour food recall, which is one way of assessing what people are eating. They weren't even hiding it. He had 7 hot dogs for dinner the night before, and that was it.
Wow.
And the dad said, and she, poker face, 7 hot dogs. Can you explain to me why you gave him 7 without what she's really thinking inside? And he said, well, he was hungry after 1. Well, of course he was hungry after 1. 1 hot dog physically is not that much food. And he didn't have any vegetables with it. He didn't have any fruit. So the person feeding him thought, well, he's still hungry. I'll feed him till he's not hungry. Well, it's really easy to eat 7 hot dogs in 20 minutes before the brain tells the stomach that you're full. Right. And that was just an example. And when we told them they could buy a pre-made salad, and this wasn't even finances as an issue. This was just knowledge. And that 1 hot dog with a pre-made salad and fruit at the end, they sort of said, that physically fills them up. We can do that. Right. So a lot of it's just education and knowledge base, but obviously it's more than that. There's addictive foods and Dave Kessler can talk about that, and a lot of other people can. The food companies have made food addictive. So.
Well, I think clearly when you're talking about childhood obesity, parents need to play a very active role. Yeah. And one thing that I sort of struggle with is how can you hold parents responsible, and whose responsibility is it to ensure that right. they are not just doing the right thing, but that they have the knowledge to do the right thing?
So I think our education system and our pediatricians need to be educating parents. And in an ideal world, I would love to see a program where we're supporting women in utero, because our data shows that women who are overweight and have gestational diabetes, a form of diabetes that's just in pregnancy, have girls who are obese and at a higher risk of early onset of pubic hair. So we need to start when women are pregnant and not do the guilt thing. I remember when I was pregnant, I was afraid to eat everything, but just make it very supportive. But the problem is it's not just parents, so we do need to provide this education from the get-go, from the in utero environment on. Right. But how many schools have eliminated recess? And PE in some of the schools is 1 day a week. Right. And I can't sit all day. I had to go for a hike yesterday, and I'm an adult. Right. So we can't expect kids to sit all day. So it's not just the parents. And some people could say, well, you could supplement it with activities. Well, a lot of parents can't. So I think that we need to be providing education to the parents, but we also need to be providing the environment for the kids. And that's society's responsibility as well.
Right, it's a tall order.
Yeah, it is.
What about boys? How is this all affecting boys?
So that's a really interesting and very complex situation in boys. And boys have not been studied in a longitudinal manner the way that our study was performed. So there have been cross-sectional analyses. In fact, a paper a couple years ago by the same group that studied the girls 17 years ago. And boys are a little unclear, and it looks like boys may not be starting puberty earlier, but obese boys in that particular investigation did have earlier onset. And for boys, it's testicular enlargement. So you actually measure testicles. It's a really hard study to do, as you can imagine. So we had to get boys to volunteer to do this. So just technically, it's difficult. But the overweight boys were not going through puberty. They were actually a little bit delayed. So it's a little bit confusing. So obesity doesn't have a direct effect, a dose-dependent effect like it does in girls. The slope's pretty clear. So I don't know that study is going to be reproduced or reproducible. I think we need the good longitudinal study. Mm-hmm. But it kind of makes sense if you think that there's obesity in boys, in fact, more in some groups. And obesity secretes estrogen. Well, that could actually delay boys' puberty.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So the situation in boys was well described.
Interesting. So one thing that you get asked about a lot, I know, is the role that toxins in the environment play. And we were talking the other day about the precautionary principle and these sort of, okay, well, we don't know for sure that these chemicals in personal care products or in in plastic cups or whatever are contributing to these hormonal changes. But given that, talk to me a little bit about that, sort of how you navigate that individually with your 2 children, and then also what you advise parents of
so the precautionary principle, for those who don't know, is an environmental concept where if you don't know if something is toxic and you have a safe alternative, then you use the safe alternative instead. So one thing that people don't realize is that chemicals do not have to be proven safe before they're released on the market. They have to be proven dangerous to be removed from the market. So somebody said this last night at the food session I was at with relation to food additives, but hundreds of chemicals are created every day, and if they do their job, then they can be used. So it's a little bit concerning because no one's kind of protecting our health at the moment. We have to protect our own health. And the chemicals are added because they're cheap and they do a better job. So let's think about BPA as an example. BPA, bisphenol A, was synthesized as one of the first synthetic estrogens for pharmacologic use. So BPA was a medicine with estrogen related at a certain dose. So it wasn't such a good estrogen. I think it caused blood clots or something. I can't remember. So somebody figured out it made plastic better. I don't know how that, because it happened. I'm not a chemist. So BPA was a good plasticizer. So then the theory is, well, does low-grade chronic exposure to BPA cause some estrogenic effects? We don't know. But there's certainly alternatives to using BPA. The problem is some of the alternatives to BPA are now BPC, other bisphenols. So what I do in my family is we use stainless steel water bottles. I don't know whether those are safer than the BPA-free bottles, but it makes me feel better,
right.
And I can afford to do that. So I think I am not an environmental scientist. I work with many great environmental scientists, but I use the resources of things like the Environmental Working Group as a really good example of what to recommend, because I trust them, and I think their apps are great. So their app, which changes names, but I think it's called Healthy Living right now. There's also a great one for teenagers done by a different organization called Think Dirty, which is kind of cute for the teenagers. And they could enter their personal care products, and at the Environmental Working Group site, you can enter your cleaning products, and you could see, is there a safer alternative to what you want to do? So my daughter wanted to paint her nails, and she's 11, and whatever I felt about that, I tried to get her the kitty piggy paint, and it was great when she was 3, but she didn't like it. So I went on one of these apps and I found a brand that's water-based, and it's perfectly good. So I could use that, or I could use the drugstore stuff, and I bought this stuff and we painted our nails, and I didn't smell, and it's lasting pretty well. So
your toes look great.
Thank you. So I think if we can shop with our wallets, vote with our wallets, it's really important. Especially, you didn't ask about this, but I want to add it with organic food. So looking at pesticides in the food supply, we don't have clear data that they trigger early puberty, but we know they have other bad effects for the people growing them and their children. So I collaborate with a group looking at the farm workers in Salinas, California, where something like 80% of our lettuce is grown. And we know that the children of those farm workers who are exposed to organophosphate pesticides have higher rate of neurocognitive problems like ADD. So if I choose to buy organic lettuce or celery, and everybody else chooses to do that, we're sending a really strong message to the growers. And then we're helping the farm workers, and we're helping their children in their community. So I think if you have a choice and you have the means, I would definitely recommend buying organic fruit and vegetables. It may not be healthier for you, but it's healthier for the environment, and it's healthier for the people who work in the fields.
I think that's a good point. And another thing about the food supply that you've written about is antibiotics, which are in food and also administered pretty willy-nilly to young children. And there is an interesting research in humans correlating early antibiotic exposure and obesity. Yeah. So it's not just a food issue, right?
No, it's not. It's not. So the antibiotic use is complex. And my concern is antibiotic in the food supply. And I think I learned last night now, maybe going to be regulated and on its way out. So one of the reasons that the farms use antibiotics is it makes animals get fatter and go through puberty and develop faster. Does this sound like anything? So unfortunately, they've learned that it's not just to prevent disease, but they also have these growth potentiating effects. So they're very effective if you're trying to rush food to the market, and it's cheap and they're readily available. And then they stop dying of infections when you're having them all live close together. So in animal studies, we've definitely found that antibiotic use is associated with obesity. There are a few very well done studies in children, which are not double-blinded, unfortunately, but they're looking at kids who had to have antibiotics as young children, so in the first year of life, for example. And those children are at higher risk of obesity several years later. So where does that leave us? And I think I had a daughter with severe ear infections, right. And I avoided the antibiotics. I finally gave her antibiotics, and I was joking. I was giving her organic food and just skipping the food supply and just feeding her the antibiotics. So in that situation, she was going to lose her hearing. I had to give her the antibiotics.
Of course.
But I think the other problem is I have patients coming in and the kid has a cold and they want an antibiotic to cure the cold. And even ear infections, not all ear infections need antibiotics. So I think we have to separate out unnecessary use and necessary use. And I'm not a farmer, but I think animals should not be getting antibiotics. And I think you shouldn't get antibiotics for every little infection. But antibiotics are life-saving drugs. So if you need them, you should take them. But I think we have to be a little more aware. And sometimes physicians, we're so busy, we just want the family to, it's been a 15-minute visit and I've got 10 patients waiting. And for a lot of physicians, it's just too easy to press that button and prescribe that antibiotic when they shouldn't. So I think we need to educate families that antibiotics are very important, but should be reserved for when they really need to be used.
Can clinicians tell which ear infections need antibiotics?
There are some signs now, and
yeah.
There's also the wait and see approach. So if it's high fever one side, but there's also the wait and see approach, which is that you say, I'm going to give you a prescription, and these are the if it doesn't get better in X number of days, it's more likely to be infected.
Got it.
So.
One thing that we were talking about the other day is that there's a sense among some populations, even in the medical community, that this is just the new normal, yeah. That this is just when girls are going through puberty. Yeah. What are the consequences of that kind of thinking? If you can close your eyes and look 10 years into the future, 50 years into the future.
Yeah. In fact, I wanted to call the book The New Normal, and everybody around me said, no, you can't. Why? Because it may now be typical or average or whatever statistical word you want to use, but it's not okay. Right. What is happening in our society that it's normal for 7-year-old girls to need bras? My son just finished 3rd grade, and I'd say a third of the girls in his class has visible breast development. And this is these are Caucasian girls in an affluent community that are not obese. So this is not okay. And it's sort of the canary in the coal mine. So what are we doing in our food supply and to our kids that's causing this earlier onset of puberty in girls? And I'm sort of trying to fight the fight and speak at things like this to get the word out that can we reverse this? A lot of us think we're at the earliest physical age that girls can go through puberty, but given that we know even if the normalization means that you're not at risk for all those bad psychological effects, we're still at risk for the breast cancer and the heart disease and the diabetes and all the other things.
So in a way, it's like the early puberty in girls is, like you said, a canary. It's the thing it's the harbinger of a million other sort of problems to come.
Yeah, and I think it's also reflective of some bad changes that have happened in our child rearing, right, as a society.
So before we go to the floor, one more question from me. What do you think in terms of research that's needed, investigation that's needed? What are the biggest questions moving forward?
Boys. Teasing out the chemicals, but it's really challenging because none of us are exposed to one single chemical. So we are writing papers and analyzing each chemical and how it affects kids or each exposure. But the problem is that nobody's taking that chemical in isolation. So, for example, if we look at a particular form of pesticide that interferes with thyroid hormone development, we just published that. Is that additive if you've also been exposed to another chemical? So it's really, really challenging. And that was our initial NIH grant, was to look at these environmental triggers. So I wish we could tease that out, but I think we're beyond that now. And I think we're at the stage of intervention and what can we do, A, to support the girls as a society, and B, to prevent this from happening. And so one of my missions and pet peeves is to change the way that puberty education is done. In this country and in other developed countries, we haven't talked about what the worldwide phenomenon of this. A lot of sex ed now starts in 6th grade. In California, where I live, it's 5th grade. But it's puberty and sex ed combined. And I told you I have a son who's in 3rd grade, and a third of his classmates have puberty, and I think more actually do because their moms are coming to tell me about it and ask me about it. So I've got a group of probably, we're looking at 3rd graders. Again, for African American girls, the average age of breast development is 8 3/4. That is 3rd grade. We're doing these boys and girls a disservice by not teaching them what's going on in their bodies. And I think we really need to have a change. I'm not a puberty education researcher. There are plenty of very good people out there. I'm just very opinionated about this. But for kids that age, when they learn about their bodies, it's not, you can do it in a way that's not that scary. And if you do it even younger, if we're talking about 6-year-old girls, it's not that long since they potty trained, since they did lots of other things physically. And you could put puberty or your changes in your body in the context of why do you need to brush your teeth? Why do you need to wash your hair? How do we prevent lice? This is chest development. This is hair on your bottom. Using the right words, you could do it for boys too. And you could separate it from sexuality, because the 7-year-old girl with breast development is not thinking about sex. She's thinking that my chest hurts, right, and I don't want to wear one of those really lacy things my mom wears, Right. So bras is what I was referring to, but because they get scared. A lot of the little girls think they have to wear and they make great, unfortunately for better or worse, they make great tank tops and bras for very young kids now. Anyway, so I think we really need to change the way that we're teaching kids about their bodies and desexualize the puberty and do it much, much, much earlier, and then still do the sex ed when they get to middle school.
So you would advocate starting to teach puberty in the 3rd grade, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the schools are lacking health education in general. We should always have health education every year, and then you could start throwing that in there. But, wouldn't it be great if we were able to reduce dental caries by teaching kids how to brush their teeth, and the next day they get a little lesson about chest development, and for the boys and the girls, because we haven't talked about the boys and the effect on boys of having the larger difference now between, if boys aren't going through puberty and girls are earlier, then there's a real disconnect there.
That's great. So we're going to go to the floor for a couple of questions. Saw you first in the pink shirt. I think is there a mic? Yeah.
Yeah.
So is there a factor in that component as far as if there's such diversity in the schools and if, let's say, 50% of the class is obese will that bring all the girls to begin to go to puberty earlier?
That's really interesting. So the question was about the fact that women who live together often cycle together, and that's also pheromonal. There's more data about that. So for girls, we haven't found that data, so we don't see a group effect of the onset of puberty, although certainly we do see that. It also requires a lot of contact. So sitting next to each other in a class may not be effective, whereas living in a dorm. The studies, I think, were done at one of the women's colleges initially. So we don't see the pheromonal effect or the group effect on onset of puberty. It's a very interesting question. The guy in the red shirt had his hand up first. Sure, yeah. Oh, in the front.
As obesity has evolved, as a clinician, I talk to young people. I speak with young people about obesity, and I often get the wall that just they disconnect. I know I've lost all their attention. A recent New York Times article suggested maybe parents shouldn't talk to kids about obesity.
Right.
How do you have some suggestions for not stimulating the rapid buildup of the wall, so you can to prevent that disconnect?
Yeah, that was the article, when is it okay to talk to your daughter about her weight or her body? And the answer is never. So I don't, when I'm in clinical practice, when I'm seeing patients, I don't use the word overweight, fat, heavy, whatever, unless I'm talking to just the parent and the kid is not in the room, or I'm showing them the BMI chart. I never say that word out loud to kids. I talk about health. So I just say, hey, do you want to have, a lot of the kids can react to having more energy level. Depends on the age of the kid, obviously. If you work with patients, you know to change that. But I talk about health and wellness and energy and really focusing on what motivates the kid. So let's say it's a basketball player. Do you want to be faster on the basketball court? Do you want to be healthier? Vegetables are going to make you healthier and faster. It's kind of a stretch, but eating broccoli is not going to make them a better basketball player, but eating broccoli more and losing weight will make them a better basketball player. So I never talk about body size or shape. I talk about strength, especially with the girls because of the high risk of eating disorders. But what we're seeing now is that we're getting more and more boys, I don't know if you're seeing this, we're getting more and more boys that are anorexic. And it used to be that it was very rare to have a young teen male that had an eating disorder, and now it's getting much more common. So I think we all need to be very careful about the language we use. And I have very mixed feelings about these BMI measurements that are being done, for example, in Massachusetts. I think on the one hand they're great, on the other hand they're terrible. So I think we have to use the word health. Health, strength, energy, those kind of words that kids respond to. It's like the analogy of what we did with cigarettes. We didn't tell kids they were going to get lung cancer. We said to teenagers, no one wants to kiss an ashtray, and you're going to smell like an ashtray if you smoke. And that was much more responsive. So that's one of the approaches I use. I don't know if you have any other.
Well, I have something about strength ratio to weight.
Strength ratio to weight, that's a great one.
So that,
Yeah.
that you move yourself. I talked about strength ratio to weight, but the one boy that comes to mind weighs 295, and he's his high school point guard.
Yeah.
And so he's
Strong
and doing well, but he's bending his bones,
Yeah.
so it's a problem.
Right. Kelly's got a question.
Thank you so much. I wish this film could go to every elementary school. I mean, really, in the country.
You could write about it.
and I will. But I was wondering if you could say more, just building on the last question. I think it's so great to see people working on apps that can make kids think how to live healthier and things like that. There are things like Curbo, but they are about weight, and I don't know how you feel about introducing those sorts of things, given the commentary and what you were saying about the narrative of all of this.
So I have very mixed feelings about those apps, because I do see patients that come in and they're over focused on the weight, and I'm focused on health. So there are apps where they're like kid-friendly versions of the calorie counting apps that we use. And so kids can record what they're eating. And I am a little concerned that with the wrong kid, that could go the wrong way. Unfortunately, we know that all eating disorders, all obesity programs and all programs where you follow obesity, something like 2 to 5% of the kids will develop an eating disorder, regardless of whether or not you have an intervention. So the problem is that kids that are overweight are already predisposed. They have body image disorder. A lot of overweight kids have an eating disorder, and we don't think of it that way. But we are now beginning to see binge eating as an eating disorder. And so you're just taking the behavior that's now causing obesity, and you could trigger it, and it can cause underweight. So I think we have to use caution with those apps and really, again, focus on strength, energy, and health. And if they want to use that as a means to do that, that's fine, but it's a little bit concerning.
Yeah.
Young girls about puberty. Do you have any good books you suggest,
Yeah.
or any other things in your practice?
Yeah, so American Girl books. So the American Girl dolls, which are, $120. The American Girl books are phenomenal. And I think that they rewrote a couple years ago The Care and Keeping of You, and they made one for younger girls and one for older girls. And I don't necessarily usually like to recommend one particular brand, but the way the book is written is excellent, and it's the style is an example of what I would like to see, because they talk about brushing your teeth, lice, and then the next page of a picture of a little girl with breast development. So those are good books, but there's other books also available, and I think you have to look at them. If you're doing it for very young girls, I recommend that a parent or an adult read it with the child. And with an older girl, you can kind of read it with the child and then leave it in the room, and they might go, "Ew, gross, I'm not going to read it," and then you spy on them and they're looking at it later. Boys, there are fewer books, but there still are books available. So I think you just have to go into a really good bookstore or look online and see and buy a bunch. So I did that as research for my book. I went online and bought sort of all 10 of them. And most of them are pretty good. If they're top sellers, they're actually pretty good. But I like the ones the thing about the American Girl book is it's about your whole body. The other books are really focused on puberty, which is fine. But if we're trying to do this for very young girls, you want to put it in the context of the rest of your body.
Thank you for this wonderful research. I would just really urge you to connect with education, which I think is absolutely key. It's not only the lack of physical activity, but it's the toxic stress that exists in schools as a result of the testing movement. And also there's a field, social emotional learning. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but that's a wonderful context that begins in kindergarten, preschool, that includes the mindfulness movement, that is a place where that leads to the development of the skills that kids need to understand and be able to talk about the sex education and puberty education issues.
I totally agree with you. I think that we need to spend more time in our schools supporting our kids on things other than reading, writing, and arithmetic. And that's exactly the context that I would love to see it. I do want to clarify what I mean by toxic stress and what we're, for these girls, it's not the high school, do 18 activities, APs, that's toxic in a different way. For the girls that I'm talking about in our study, it's more the girls who witness family violence, who have violence in their neighborhood, who have food insecurity. That's the kind of toxic stress that we think is triggering the early onset of the puberty in these girls, and it starts very, very young. So even before a lot of them are in the education system. And that's why I'd love to see some support given. And there are groups out there that are starting to do this to support the families and educate, because this is girls that may be exposed to this at age 2 or 3 before they're even in the school system, and how we can support them. And we have to do that through their families.
That question is great for what I was going to ask you. So I'm in that field, write a lot of books about girls, and I've read your work, and I've tried my best to summarize it in one of the books I have coming out, but I knew it wasn't good enough. And so, and I'm listening to you thinking, oh, I missed this point, I should have done, that kind of stuff. So here's my request. My request is, there's a lot of people like me who are very eager when they know about your work to be able to share it with other people in the SEL community or in the educational community. So my request is, could you write us like a 10-point thing of what is the most important, for those of us who have platforms to parents, can you write us a 10-point thing that you want us to make sure that we communicate to parents or to educators, for those of us who do have this ability to go out and make these connections for people? Because when people listen to me speak, they're not necessarily thinking that I'm going to talk to them about early puberty, but I very much want to do that in connection with the socialization of girls.
Yes.
So that's something I would love to be able to do, so I make sure I do it right.
Okay, maybe we should look at maybe putting that on our website. That might be a good place for that. Thank you for that.
Over there.
Hi, thank you so much. It was really a fascinating presentation. I'm Jamie Bassam with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We've spent over a decade working on childhood obesity prevention. And I was really intrigued by, what you addressed in terms of, we know 50% of all women of reproductive age are actually starting out their pregnancies overweight or obese. And you really elevated this notion around a need to support women in utero. And so I guess the question is, so where do we start? Is this about revisiting Institute of Medicine waking guidelines? Is this about, policy, environment, better educating OBs and sort of their role? So I would just be really curious sort of what we do in that P space, that pregnancy space, or, preconception space from your perspective.
So I want to start by saying, when I was pregnant, I hated hearing what I was supposed to be doing, because I was either nauseous or exhausted the whole time, or nauseous, exhausted, and taking care of a toddler. And then the pressure, and I remember there was a particular food item I liked, and it had high fructose corn syrup in it, and I was craving it, and my husband used to throw it away. It drove me insane. So I think I felt like he was being the police. So I think I just want to throw that out there. We have to be really careful about not policing, and I knew better, but I didn't care. I was nauseous. It was all that I wanted. So I think that being said, I think in a way the IOM part is sort of the medical aspect, and I think this isn't about the healthcare system. I'm in the healthcare system, but it's like the last step. I think it needs to be personal and policy and education, and how can we non-judgmentally let women know that, I think women know, they as soon as you find out you're pregnant, you're very worried and you want to hug this thing that's growing inside you, that becomes a baby. I shouldn't say thing, but when they're very early, you want to do your best. You really want to do your best. So I think, how do we make it easier for them to do their best? So for the environments of the children that I'm talking about, we're talking about kids that live in East Harlem that are in food deserts. And that's another buzzword now we use, but a food desert is a place you can't get fresh fruits and vegetables. So maybe we need more things like the Daily Plate that's in Dorchester, Massachusetts, or other ways to change the food pantries. So in San Francisco, there's a pilot now going on on with stocking the food pantries with less processed foods. A lot of them have had, the food banks have only had processed foods. So if that's where you get your food, you don't have a choice about what you're buying. It's potatoes. And so how can we get them away from that and get the people who can't afford to purchase the healthier food much more easily? And I think that would just make it the resistance to, because the resistance to being able to get the healthy food, because we know that socioeconomic factors really factor in. So if you provide the education, the support, and then give people what they need easily, I think things like the daily plate are phenomenal. And if you emphasize that, if you had a pregnant woman cooking class, so how to satisfy your cravings with easy, inexpensive food, and then you can show them. So I think it really is a policy and education aspect. I don't think the IOM changing its weight guidelines is going to make an iota of difference to the 50% of women that are pregnant, and because so many of them are facing other socioeconomic challenges. And then the toxic stress aspect, which feeds into that. But then on a policy level, I think, since we think that antibiotics and high fructose corn syrup and other things in the food supply are increasing BMI or making it easier to gain weight, I think we have to have changes in our food systems. That's easy to do, right?
Right.
Snap.
Hi, my name's Amy. I'm not in this arena professionally. I have two questions in two different directions. You talked about the age from 11 to 13, and now it's 8 3/4 to 9 1/4, whatever that was. I'm kind of curious, and I don't know this. If you look at the 100-year span before we were born, most of the people in this room, what was that trend?
In periods or in puberty?
Yeah. Okay, both,
Yeah.
right? So that's one question. The other question is, I look at society and we all know that everything is getting what I would describe as pushed down.
Yeah.
So when we were exposed to certain things, whether it be drugs, alcohol, sex, growing up, right, that's now, over time, has become precipitously more and more at a younger age. And you have to wonder, like, to what end and what, it's not just education. I just look at the world and I wonder, how is this ever going to reverse itself? I mean, are we going to get to the point, I'm truly exaggerating, where people are having sex at 4?
Yeah.
I mean, and they're just exploring. They don't know any better. But this is crazy.
Yeah. Okay. So the two questions. So the historical context. So breast development's been less well studied for obvious reasons. It's hard to do. You actually have to examine girls. In terms of periods, we do know, I think a lot of people know that periods used to start a lot later. They have shifted down, so 17, 16, 200 years ago now, average age 13, now 12, partly related to good nutrition. So if you're underweight or you're malnourished, which most of us used to be as a regular part of just life, then you're going to get your periods later. So in terms of breast development, it looks like the shift is a year or so, or 2 years, a year and a half in the last 60 years. But the shift is rapidly increasing. If you look at the study between 97 and ours, and it's hard to compare them because it's a little bit like comparing apples and oranges, but we are looking at an additional shift of 4 months over 17 years, which is a really rapid shift if you think about how old these girls are when this is happening. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a lot in the percentage of their life. But we do think that there's going to be a biological minimum. I'm not sure we think it's going to go much younger. So then you turn to the sort of the sexualization that you're talking about, and I think we haven't gotten a chance to talk about that, but kind of the second half of the book that Julie was really involved with as an adolescent psychologist was what can parents and educators do to support the girls who, as they're going through this. So I think I can talk about that a little bit. So it's not inevitable that an early bloomer is going to end up depressed, using drugs, and having sex. Context is everything. And parents need to really feel empowered to make the changes so that, no, we're not going to have 4-year-olds having sex. And we really want to get the message out there that parents need to stand up and say they can determine what's right for their kids and what's not right for their kids. And educators in the school system, there's something that we need to do about the sexualization in the media, because that's pretty atrocious. And there's concerns about that. There was a particular store that used to have a huge image of a half-naked teenage boy. They're not doing so well financially. But I used to sort of steer my daughter away from them when we walked past, because I didn't want her looking at this clearly sexualized image. And I was being overprotective. But that's something that we didn't talk about. You said, what do you do about your kids in terms of nail polish? I also am very careful about what media I expose my kids to. Books is harder because my daughter is an avid reader and she's read the Hunger Games when she was 10. But I think that reading is not as bad as seeing. And we are having so much sexualization in the media that we need to push back against that. And parents should be limiting if they think that it's not appropriate for their kid or what their kid is wearing or who their kids are hanging out with, parents need to be empowered to say, no, you can't do that. And then they need to give their kids the skills so that their kids can say no. So we actually outline things that you can do. So I sort of joke about the healthy eye roll. That's not the eye roll your kid does to you when you tell them to do something. But it's the, hey, you want to go do that? And you're like, no. Tell the kid to look at the friend who's asking them to do something that's dangerous, sneer and eye roll like it's the stupidest idea they've ever heard. Or an older kid, if the parent says, have a cigarette, have a joint. Now kids aren't smoking cigarettes, they're smoking marijuana. And yes, we're in the state where that's legal, but I think no one would argue that that's not good for teenagers. They can say things like, oh my God, my mom would kill me. Or I have a basketball game tomorrow, speaking to that. I can't because I won't be as fast on the basketball court. So we need to give parents and kids skills so that they can push back against both the societal pressure and the social pressure to do things that are inappropriate for them. So the other one that I've taught some of my patients, and they love this, they think it's really funny, but sadly, if you have a 10 or 11-year-old who looks a lot more mature and they're in that situation where they might get asked out on dates, you say, do you know how old I am? I'm 11. And then the guy, would hopefully appropriately kind of back off if they thought they were 15 or 16. So there's things that we need to empower our girls to do. We also need to be teaching our boys about, there's so many things we could teach our boys. We focus on the girls and like it's their responsibility, and it's not. It's everybody's responsibility. But I think we really need to give the kids these little skills that they can have. And stepping back and telling parents that it's what's okay and what's not okay. So my anecdote, which I told yesterday at lunch, I don't know if anybody's here. When my daughter was about 7, I walked into a mall. I was trying to buy her sundress, 7-year-old cute little sundress. And I walked into this very popular, well-known store, and there was a giraffe print off the shoulder little skimpy thing. And of course it's giraffe print. So my 7-year-old girl goes, I want that, Mommy, that's so cute. And I said, kind of loudly, because that's who I am, I said, no, so-and-so, the store, got mixed up. They thought that was a teenage outfit, and they accidentally made it in little kid clothes. And as I'm on my way out of the store, the mom next to me goes, yep, me too, I'm going too, and we named another store. And the shop people were like this. They were sort of shocked that I was that rude, but I was so horrified. This was in the front, and they were trying to sexualize size 4 kids. So I think we, again, vote with your wallet and don't buy those things, and we need to really push back and say what little girls should be wearing and shouldn't be wearing.
Do you have any, we'll go to you in 1 second. Do you have any specific advice about screen time and the sexualization? It's like, how do you control, particularly in boys, but in girls too?
So the screen time is bad for 2 reasons. One is the actual screen, and then the second is the content. So I hope this audience knows that screen time can be associated with sleep disturbance in kids, and if the content is violent, I think everybody knows that can be harmful. So screen time feeds into sleep, and I think I'm definitely the sleep police in my house, and I think parents should be the sleep police and the screen police. So no screens 2 hours before bedtime, limit screen time to 1 hour or 2 of social use. I think you have to be careful with teenagers, they need it for school, but really, and mimicking that, so that means you're only on the screen for 1 hour a day, and I have kids that call me on it. I'm on Facebook, I'm like, Mom, you've been on there longer than 1 hour, so I put it away. The content is really harder to control, so I think you have to be kind of not in your kid's face, because you don't want to be the helicopter parent that doesn't give your kid any freedom, but you have to be aware of what they're doing. And the sexualization is a problem, so I think a lot of people say, well, I pay the bills, I have your passcodes, and I will be randomly looking. So if you're a parent, you have access to your kid's phone. Not that you don't want, you want to build trust, but you also want them to think that in the back that you could do that. The other thing that I really recommend is no screens in the bedroom. So absolutely have a place in your house that has where everybody, including your own, phone sleeps and is charged overnight. So it's both the content as well as the actual screen. But it's hard. I think that's another place we need to look at where the responsibility lies, parents, society, and then teenagers themselves.
Right.
And teens will always do stupid things, right? And that's part of their normal.
Inevitable.
It's normative. They should.
Right.
So, Snapchat is what I'm thinking.
Right.
So,
Was there a question over here?
Hi, my name's Amanda, and I'm asking you this question as a parent. I will confess I have your book on my nightstand and have not finished it, and from what I gather, the second half may answer the question I'm about to pose to you. I have a 10-year-old daughter and a daughter who will be 13 in August. My 13-year-old daughter looks like she's 20. This is because of this issue. She developed very early. Emotionally, she's a 12-year-old. And where I have struggled to help her and support her is in having candid conversations about sexuality with her. She gets a lot of attention that she does not know how to handle, but speaking to her in an age-appropriate way. When you have these young girls who are being sexualized either just by walking down the street or, in my daughter's case, online bullying, which has just been terrible to deal with, how do you speak to them in an age-appropriate way when they're living in these bodies that are not, you know, congruent with their age?
Yeah, I'm sorry that you're, it's very hard, and it's hard because part of me feels like you want to let her know that all of us we are judged by how we look. And that's true regardless of gender or age. If I was up here in my workout gear, my ponytail, you might be looking at me differently. I don't look so professional. And so we talk about, you talk about dressing appropriately for the occasion or dress without making it sexual, and that can be for boys or girls. Because there is some inherent sexism of why should she have to hide her body so that men don't catcall her, and it's really the men catcalling that's the problem. So you don't want to place blame on her. So I don't know if she's pushing limits with clothing, but then we just sort of talk about how we have to we dress right for the occasion. But the bullying thing is really hard because that's peer-to-peer, I'm assuming. And that is a very different scenario, and it may also be the other early blooming girls, and that is part of the problem. So I think you have to support her to feel good in herself, and it may not be talking about what she can't do, but talking about what she can do. So your body is strong, and you're a great athlete, or if she's great at something, and really building up those other non-sexualized side of her. But it's a hard one because you don't want her leaving the house in a provocative outfit, but again, whose fault really is that?
Right.
So it's a double-edged sword, and I feel Julie really does put more in the second half of the book about how to support you. But I do think really emphasizing girls' strength and their bodies are there for good reasons. Our bodies are not sex organs. Our bodies, we run with them, we play with them, we think with them, and we use them. And really emphasizing all those other great things that her body can do.
I think we'll take one more question. Did you?
The main reason I'm here, I've got 12 grandchildren. 8 of those are granddaughters. So it's a sort of ancillary question, but when I was younger, when I was going through school a lifetime ago, literally, we had grammar school, then we had junior high, and then senior high. And senior high was 9, 10, 11, or 10, 11, 12. Now we've gone to senior high and middle school. So we've got, 14-year-old girls walking around with 17, 18-year-old guys and girls. So, do you have any thoughts about how we've moved that education grade structure in lieu of all this?
So, most schools are K through 5, 6, 6 or 7 through 8, and 9 through 12. There aren't that many that are 7 through 12, although there are some in the private school sector. I think I'd speak more to the younger age. So, psychologically, there's data that suggests and that shows, and it's old data, that K through 8 is a better structure than K through 5, 6, and 6 through 8. And you think about that, that's because you're with the same group of kids, and they're judging you on who you were before you went through puberty, and whether you went through puberty in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th doesn't matter as much, and you may not get into some of the trouble. So particularly for bullying and what she was talking about, it's often protective to be in the same school environment from K to 8, and then switch at 9th grade. So what's interesting is that Julie and I both chose schools that were K through 8 based on that, well before we published this book. And it's funny when we were talking about our school choices, because I actually had to go to a private school because San Francisco doesn't have that many K through 8 that are public. And she chose a charter that was K through 8. So I think if you have a choice, that the data has suggested that historically K through 8 may be better psychologically. Not so much recent data, but that still makes sense. And then separating and having 9 through 12. So I think that's probably a safer idea. You're still going to have 9th grade boys that look like they're 10 and 9th grade girls that look like they're 25, and that you just can't change that. But if we provided the social emotional learning, like our speaker over there, our questioner over there said, then hopefully we're buffering them from that a little bit.
Thank you so much.
Sign
Yes. For everyone who wants a copy of the book, they will be available in the corner, and she'll be signing them.
Yeah, so someone's selling them from Explore Books, and I'll be signing them out. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here this morning, bright and early.